Today, I'm having a chat with Sarah Roberts of the Empty Cradle. I've been following her for a while and receiving her emails, which are beautiful emails, hearing about how she helps women through their journey of healing, feeling, wanting to be a mother and not being able to, and how they fit back into their community. Her story on her website starts with a poem, and it's The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll, which I absolutely love. It says, "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax of cabbages and kings." And then underneath that, she says, "The time has come for us to talk about childlessness, motherhood, infertility, pain, joy, loss, confusion, identity, and most importantly, finding ourselves anew." Hello, Sarah. It's lovely to meet you finally, virtually. 'Cause I really, really love what you do. And your introduction is like healer, teacher, counselor, creator. And I notice on your website you've got a lot of paintings as well. So later on, I'd like you to talk us through that because I'm really into stories and creativity and how they
Oh,
make
I love that.
help.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Kate.
Oh, you're so welcome. Um, all right. What I'd really love to know, and I'm sure others would like to know about your story.
Yeah.
How did you come to being here?
Yeah. So, um, my work, uh, I have a counseling service and I do individual and group and programs as well. And
Mhm,
I work with women. It's often women at midlife
mhm,
who had hoped to be mothers or had
mhm,
imagined motherhood into their future,
mhm,
and it didn't happen for them. So it's women coming to terms with that transition from hopeful of motherhood, imagining it may have happened, into it didn't happen, and what does life look like for me now?
mhm,
And look, the essence of my story is that has been very much my personal story as well. So I had hoped. Um, I know this can be quite stigmatized to talk about, but
mhm,
in my late teens, early 20s, somewhere in the midst of that, I remember having a pregnancy scare, and I was fortunate at that point in time that I wasn't pregnant. But I remember that 2 week waiting period and kind of thinking it through and wondering about motherhood, and really what happened for me at that point was that the archetype of motherhood landed very deeply within me. And I knew that meeting my own children, raising that really significant human project of raising children, um, I knew that that was really important to me. It was really not good timing at that point.
mhm,
And so then really in my 20s, I did what a lot of us did in our 20s, where, traveled and focused on career and education and just that sense of really being a young woman in the world. And I love that period of my life. And then in my early 30s, I met my current partner. And by about 34, 35 was when we started to try for children. And that included um, a decade of trying to conceive, which included IVF. It
mhm,
included um, really, I guess what happened for me during that time was that my identity was so strongly embedded in this sense of being a mother and being part of my future. I just hadn't imagined what a future life might look like without that. Um, and so that transition at the end of the decade, and we finished when I was, I think, 45, 46, around that age.
mhm,
And it really threw me into this incredibly deep wounding and deep grief, I guess. And I did reach out to some therapists and counselors, and found it very difficult to get the support I needed during that time.
Mm.
And I guess what I realized is because my professional background had been in counseling and child protection and youth work
Right.
and that sort of work,
Yeah.
I kind of realized that essentially it was actually because our stories were quite disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
So older childless women really there hadn't been a lot of research done. There really wasn't much of a context, I guess, for counselors and therapists to receive the training that they needed to understand the experience. Um, and so after that, I think I went through this period of time where I thought that there might be something else that I might end up doing.
Mm-hmm.
And my partner and I, we took a 3-month break, and it was like a full stop at the end of that decade. And we went and walked 800 kilometers across Spain,
Yes,
uh,
as everybody does.
as everybody does. And look, it seems really exotic, but actually it
Yeah.
was staying in some quite, cheap hostels across the Camino de Santiago.
Yeah.
Um, and look, I naively at that point had thought, well, I'll walk for 3 months and all my grief will be done and it'll all
Mm-hmm.
be, neatly packaged away and then I'll be ready for my next life.
Of
And
course.
grief doesn't work like
Yeah.
that.
No.
Um, yeah. And so that was the next step was around, I came back and I fell into a very deep pit of grief and then really went then and had a look at what was happening for me,
Mm.
really did some work around retraining around the grief and spent quite a few years actually really tending to my healing and growth
Yeah.
in order to be ready to be able to hold the space for other women. So
Mm.
yeah, and that's been a
Yeah.
really significant as a lived experience counselor. There's some really significant components of that, isn't there,
Yes. Yeah, that's
to
right.
hold that well.
Yeah, because I
Yeah,
have a lot of clients come to me and say, like, I have been to psychologists and counselors and, so many people, but they just don't get the essence of the grief
yeah,
because it's not lived grief, it's
yeah,
book grief.
yes,
So, and often they come to me with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, stages of grief. And it's like, no, no, you don't do this. It's like this huge mess.
yes,
You have to
yes,
untangle and,
yes, yeah,
unravel.
yeah.
And yeah,
And we do, don't we? We work in a cultural context of actually quite low grief literacy.
yes,
Um, Often it can be seen as this problem to be solved, or
yes,
these clear stages to go through, or
yeah,
um, one of the other things I see with women is that this sense of it being this pit that you go into and it's fairly
yep,
neat, and then you come back out and then you're done,
yep, that's right.
or even this sense of it's just completely overwhelming and it's just this, it's like this complete mess of overwhelm. And it's like, well, no, actually, we are actually able to give you some way markers and
Yeah,
there are things that can be done to support you through your grieving.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah,
so
yeah. And oh, what did you say then? There was something that I caught on and it's just disappeared then. Oh yeah, the getting over,
yeah,
like you go into this pit, you get up, you get over it, and then you live
yeah,
life.
yeah, yeah,
Like it's not like that. Grief is like forever. You learn
yeah,
to live alongside it.
yes,
And, it's there,
yeah,
changes
yes,
over time, not in
yes,
those stages that people always, no, well, not always, but it's the most common knowledge of grief.
yes,
You do this, accept it, yay,
yeah,
and you're
yeah,
fixed. That's the
yeah,
thing, you're fixed. So
exactly.
yeah,
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 yeah.
and
Whereas I love hearing grief therapists talk about their work because there's such a like a rich understanding, I think, of just how much grief can touch a human soul and
yeah,
how we can be impacted, but also in many ways transformed
yes.
by the grief experience.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. Yes,
yeah,
yeah. So, like in your story, you spoke of the generations of women before. And it's like what you expect your life to be. And when it doesn't turn out that way,
Yeah.
it's difficult to understand why why did this happen to me
Yeah.
after the
Yeah.
generations previous had,
Yeah. Yeah.
20 kids and,
Yes. Yeah.
and just fell pregnant at the drop of a hat. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, do you want to say something about that and what that was like for you?
Absolutely. So the beginning point of that is I know that we very much think of ourselves as being individuals, and we often live in a society where we can
Mm.
sometimes think of ourselves as being self-made or part of a
Mm-hmm.
meritocracy and that sort of thing. But the truth is we're actually also we have our individual story, but we're also part of our cultural and generational
Mm-hmm.
story. And
Mm.
so my story, I was born in the late 1960s, in 1969,
Mm-hmm.
and the generation before me and quite a few generations before that, had been women who in the 50s had been very much post World War II, taking women out of the workplace, denying opportunities perhaps around education and work and our aspirations around what we might have had ambitions for in the
Mm.
world. And so there was very much like almost a breaking of the bonds of the assumed, you have to be a mother and the domestic sphere and liberation in many ways for women was actually about opening up opportunities. And so my generation was very much about, you know, navigating the complexity of those changes. And
Mm-hmm.
often the generations of women before us didn't necessarily have the frame of reference. Those changes were so rapid
Yes.
that that having mothers and grandmothers who could support us through, the complexity of career and where does your personal hopes fit within that in terms of our domestic spaces and lives and relationships. So that was really difficult, I think, to navigate. Um, the other thing was that the education we received, so in terms of sexual health education,
Mm.
in terms of contraception, the assumption was that if you could turn off, you could had the pill and you could turn off reproduction,
Yep.
you could turn it back on whenever you wanted.
Mm.
And
Mm.
education we received was about don't get pregnant, don't get STIs,
Yep.
don't have children too young, um, and and so I think navigating the complexity of those, particularly the 20s and then into your 30s, I think for many women, it was quite a wake up call for us to actually go, oh, fertility actually can be a little bit more complex than expected. Um, I also wanted to mention within the cultural context is there certainly can be a real patriarchal frame around this, which is an assumption that for women to be fully realized adult women, that
Mm-hmm.
womanhood equals motherhood. And
Yes.
and we really see that in the child-free space where women have clearly said, I don't want to be mothers. And
Mm.
we have a real problem accepting the validity of women's choices, the legitimacy of their identity,
Mm.
and then to really actually validate women as fully realized women, whether they're mothers or not. Um, and so I think in terms of scholarship, there's been a lot of feminist scholarship around motherhood and the child-free choice. So there's been some scholarship since the 1970s.
Mm.
And what has been the quite silenced um, story has been the story of women like me, where they did want motherhood, or there might have been some ambivalence, but not being able to be a mother may have landed and caused grief and complexity, I guess. So what I'm noticing is that women like myself over the last 10 or 15 years or so are starting to find their voice and tell their stories publicly and really um, there's more research starting to happen. there's more advocacy starting to happen. And so really it's this quite solid group of women, and it could be around 10 to 15% of women who
Oh, wow.
had wanted motherhood and it didn't happen. So
Yeah, yeah.
so yeah, um,
Wow.
that's
That's
been a real
more,
shift, I think.
yeah, because that's more than I expected. 50,
Yeah.
around 15%. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. So
Wow.
we don't completely know the numbers, and this is part of
Mm.
the cultural silencing, is that it's
Yes.
pretty much not being on the research agenda. So we know that about 1 in 5 women, about 20% of women, um, don't have children. What
Mm.
we don't know is a really clear split between whether it's by choice or whether
Mm.
it's not by choice, or whether women didn't have the agency to actually realize what their goals were in terms of reproduction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and so estimates are around, I've heard between 30 and 90%,
Yeah.
but I've certainly heard possibly a good 2/3 of that group are
Wow.
childless, not by choice, or would have chosen to have children.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
I know a lot of women who have been through 13 and 15 rounds of IVF and still, and having all those hormones as well, and
yes,
then being pregnant, like being pregnant 10 to 15 times and losing that baby. That's
uh,
just, it's heartbreaking at that
yeah,
people don't understand that losing that baby, it was a baby,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I remember, like my doctor, when I had my first miscarriage, he said the, oh, do you know what? It's gone out. It's gone out of my head. Goodness. Oh, he said the fetus has perished. And I did not get that in my
yeah,
head. The fetus, like I'm pregnant, I'm having a baby. Why is it a fetus?
yeah.
Because as a pregnant woman, you
Felt quite
sort of think,
clinical.
yeah, you think of the future.
Yes,
It's
yeah,
like I'm going to be pregnant for 9 months and then give birth. And then,
yeah, yeah,
and even in all
yeah,
the training back then in the 70s and 80s for pregnant women were around having a really good birth,
yeah,
not,
yes, yes,
talking about anything else. But, this thing that it's a fetus, or, you've had so many miscarriages or been implanted. It's not, is it implanted? It's not. When the eggs are
it is. It's
transferred,
implanted. Yeah,
implanted,
yeah,
and
the transfer.
not,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and then not
yeah,
having a live baby in the end. So, all that grief as well. It's
yes,
not only understanding that there will be no babies ever, it's that you have had IVF or have tried and, had
yeah,
miscarriages.
yeah, yeah. And you
So,
might look back on that. Um, and so for and this is something I think within the miscarriage space,
mm,
is that there's starting to be a voice around, the discussion about the rainbow baby and the
yeah,
the post miscarriage children.
yeah,
And what's been missing from that story is that there's a significant number of women that actually don't ever go on to having children, or and
yeah,
and what's that story like? And so what can happen is that miscarriage, there can be that period of time where it's really acute, and then that support
mm,
is so important.
mm,
Um, and then down the track, 5, 10 years down the track, from a childlessness experience, like that pregnancy may have been the closest that I got to ever meeting
yeah,
any of my biological children. And
yeah,
so it's the loss of that pregnancy in that child's life, but it's also the loss of motherhood itself. And
mm,
so what you do, and this is I do some training for women, sorry, for professionals in fertility clinics, but then also um, some training for therapists. And this is not an activity that I would necessarily suggest for women themselves, but this really links into Darcy Harris's work around non-death loss and the loss of our assumptive world. So one of the activities that I often suggest for clinicians to consider is within parameters around safety and trauma and in terms of regulation, is to imagine one story, which is the pregnancy, there's a successful pregnancy, and then it's very easy to imagine the life going forward. Like there's a huge amount of variation, but there's
Yeah.
certain milestones and markers that are my life, my child's life, what might the next few decades of my life look like. And then sitting that alongside the story for women who perhaps didn't have the opportunity to conceive, or who had conceived and didn't have a pregnancy and children, is to then think forward through, what does that look like? And for many women, it can actually be this sense of just this vast openness, which can actually be quite overwhelming.
Yeah.
In that there's the loss, first of all, of that assumptive world. And then the second piece of it is, I'm at a really low ebb. I'm deep, perhaps within this grief and trauma, and trying to manage my own psychological well-being, and then often feel so poorly equipped to then engage with the challenge of this completely open possibility. And this actually asks something of me, to kind of, and often what we might hear, and we hear comments the whole way along that can be quite disenfranchising. So it can be things like, aren't you lucky? Like, being a mum's really hard. You
Yes.
dodged a bullet, or have one of mine, or
Yes.
or just adopt. So those problem solving challenges.
Yeah.
Another one that can be quite disenfranchising can be, well, you've just got to focus on something else, or put your energy into volunteering, or why don't you adopt, or you could go and write a book. Or, and if you think about it, you've got somebody who's sort of sitting in the rubble of their shattered dreams, just going, my God, I don't even know where to begin to make sense of this. And we can often be so disenfranchised. And yeah, I think that's possibly why often, as a lived experienced clinician, I'll have women who, a lot of what I will be doing is normalizing and validating. And so my work is, because I work exclusively and I work only with women transitioning to childlessness, I've heard so many stories, and I can often listen to women and go, yeah, that's normal for us. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You might find it, you might find pregnancies announcements really triggering,
Oh,
or
yes.
you might be jealous of, jealousy might come up if there's, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just being able to sit with the complexity of that is really, really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's hard because grief is not spoken about, and grief is like, okay, you get over it, the funeral's done, or, that baby is gone, you're motherless now, just get on with it. It's like there's no idea that, how do you get on with it
Yes.
as well? And there's no
Yeah.
conversation. Like, I'm thinking about, creating communities of, people who understand as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Your people that will be there to sit and listen and
Yeah.
not try to problem solve or fix.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just so
Yeah.
important to have those people around you that
Yes.
understand what you're going through.
Yeah. Yeah. It's significant, isn't it? It's that,
Mm.
because often what happens for women is, when they're met with so many responses and their stories aren't held,
Mm.
often they may isolate off. And
Mm-hmm.
that process can be, what's wrong with me?
Yes.
Like, and often women may have not connected or spoken to other women who've been through a similar experience.
Mm.
Um, and it can be really validating.
Mm.
And even for women to have a space to even talk about the importance of what motherhood had meant to them. And
Mm.
many women may have started nesting or imagining
Yes.
often well before the pregnancy.
Mm.
And there might have been, items that have been collected. There might be precious items that women might want to pass on to their children.
Mm.
cultural stories, family memories, a whole lot of that. So the women I work with will often struggle with legacy, meaning,
Mm.
purpose. What do I do with these items? I don't feel like there's going to be
Yeah.
anything. And there is, I would say, like there's certainly almost like a death of a sense of identity and self, and
Mm.
also of the life that women thought that they were living, where they're going, oh, I thought I was in this life. This was where I imagined it might be going.
Yeah.
To all of a sudden go, oh, this is different from what I expected. So
Mm.
it is
Mm.
quite a transition process.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. And difficult, and it doesn't, like, there's no timeline either.
No.
It's for that
Yeah.
person, whatever
Yeah.
happens for that person.
Yeah.
'Cause I
That's
often hear,
so true.
yeah, I often hear, "Oh, aren't you over that yet?" Or "Haven't you
Yeah.
dealt with that yet?"
Yeah.
It's like, oh, and another thing is you're so strong. That's the thing that gets me, because it sort of makes the person look different to what they feel, and
Yeah.
they can't share their story. Like,
Yeah.
you're so strong means, okay, you don't want to listen to what I really have to say, because
Yeah.
this is a mask right now,
Yeah.
and you're telling me that I'm strong, so I can't share that
Yeah.
emotion of whatever I'm feeling with you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I'll look strong for you.
Yeah.
Mm.
There's a lot of implicit messages in there, aren't there? There
Mm.
can be I mean, for a lot of women, they experience difficulties around things like even questions in a social context around, do you have kids?
Oh, I know.
And
It's
women really grapple with
heartbreaking.
that because they
I
go,
know.
I know that if I answer that really honestly, I might make you feel really uncomfortable.
Yes.
And and so women are often doing a lot of what we call emotional labor in the background, where
Mhm.
they're actually going, ah, that's something that I need to manage my response to that. But I
Mm.
also need to make some choices around what I do or don't disclose for
Mhm.
me to stay connected in this group, but then
Mm.
potentially also for others to feel comfortable with me being here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that really comes back to grief literacy, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah,
It
that's
really
right.
comes back to how do we kind of sit with and validate the complexity of all our human stories?
Mm. Mm.
And yeah, yeah, and that idea of being strong is almost like, well, you're strong, so you're kind of taken care of. So
Yes,
I don't
that's
I
right.
don't need to I
Yeah,
don't need to offer connection
that's
or
right.
support or
No, no,
yeah, yeah,
no. That's right. You can be over there, live your life over there,
yeah,
whereas I'm living mine here.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that I think creates a lot of relationship and friendship difficulties as
Oh
well.
yeah, huge
Because
complexity.
yeah, because the people around you don't know how to be, or don't know what to say, so they don't
Yeah,
interact either.
yeah,
And often
yeah,
there's a depression as well that happens with grief.
yes,
Well, so
yeah,
but it's it's difficult. Oh, it's difficult to talk to people around your grief when they're sitting there going, "Oh, how can I fix you?" Rather than sitting, being present with what's going on for you.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And I often wonder about that in terms of how do we, and I do some self-reflection on this around how do how do we be present to all the different stories in our
Mm.
lives?
Mm.
Um, and that if I'm hoping for my story to be held, how am I doing that? And how am I showing up in my relationships?
Yes.
Um, and one of the things that really happens a lot for women around childlessness, it's particularly really challenging during the 30s and early 40s, but particularly those years where siblings, friends, peers
Mm.
are forming their families. And there can be there can be a deep empathy around, so often when women are having children and parenting, they may be mindful that a friend is struggling going through IVF or isn't having children. So sometimes the silence can be around, I just really feel for my friend, but I don't know what to say. And I feel really uncomfortable.
Mm.
And I'm struggling to find a language, and I don't want to upset my
Yeah.
friend by mentioning it. And it almost can be like, I describe it almost as two repelling magnets, where this side of it is the person who's moved into parenting, and I'm really worried about what do I say? How do I connect, making that person feel worse? And then
Yeah.
the person on this side who is potentially being triggered by being around my friend who's heavily pregnant, or being
Mm.
around the children, or some of those things may actually be bringing up my trauma and my grief.
Mm.
Um, and so there's a lot of complexity in
Mm.
those relationships, and how do we hold space for those conversations, I think
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
really significant. um yeah, and I think that's part of, I think, what we offer as counselors and therapists is sometimes it's even about finding a language to say, I haven't been through what you're going through, and I don't understand it. And I'm just wondering what you're needing. And is there any way that I can support you? Or how can I make it okay for you to feel included?
Mm.
Um, and then at the same time, having a look at how is the grief showing up in the friendship. And
Mm.
so I'll often be working with women around supporting them to learn the skills to hold and navigate their own story and responses. And so there's a lot of self-compassion work that we do. There's a lot of work around, you know, unpacking their story, unpacking their conception story, but potentially also their story of motherhood. Because there's actually a significant number of women who actually are childless by circumstance, where they
Mm.
didn't have an opportunity to try to conceive. And there can be a lot of ambiguity in those losses. Um, yeah, so really creating those spaces for dialogue and for connection, and that it's about mutuality and reciprocity in
Mm.
relationships. Yeah,
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 yeah. And being willing as well. That's the thing, to
absolutely.
have those tough, like they're really tough
Oh
conversations. You're
my God,
taking a
yes.
risk, aren't you?
Yeah,
For
yeah.
actually, saying to your friend, how can I help you?
Yes.
What can I
Yeah.
do for you? And then the friend actually showing up and saying, well, this is what I need.
Yes. Yes.
Right now I need to be away from you, or something like that. That can
Yes.
feel
Yeah.
hurtful.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
it's just the relationship needs to be built in a different way.
Absolutely. It's like we're journeying through this complex transition. And in
Yeah.
the same way that the transition to parenthood can
Mm.
really impact on friendships, the
Mm.
transition to non-parenthood can impact
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Or even the uncertainty of, I don't know how this is going to land. So there could be
Mm.
those years of conception, and it's like, this is really difficult for me as I'm navigating the uncertainty of this.
Yes.
Um, yeah, and I'll often say to women, what are the core messages that you're needing to communicate to your
Mm.
friend? Which can be,
Mm-hmm.
I love you, I care for you. This
Yes.
friendship is so significant. And how can we find a way during the complexity of this to actually talk about how hard it is?
Mm.
Because, I know for some women, well, for lots of women who are transitioning into parenting, that's a really big process to
Mm.
transition. And to be able to, say to a friend who's not parenting, hey, this is really hard and I'm really struggling with this.
Mm.
So how do we create the spaces for the complexity of women's stories?
Mm.
Yeah, and how precious that is. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I want to go into, like, there's a lot of art around you in your video. There's a video
Mm.
telling your story, and there's a lot of art around you. How does that fit into your life or fit into your professional life as well?
So I've been painting and since I was and doing a lot of women's crafts. So I shouldn't say women's crafts, doing lots of crafts, so
Yes.
quilting and etc. Um, I have kind of always had a creative arts practice.
Mhm.
Kind of as an amateur, I never really did it in kind of a professional way.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about the series of paintings that I used in that were in my videos is that they came from a friend of mine who was an artist, and the thing I love about those is I actually love that they're portraits of women in their 20s and 30s.
Mm.
And so one of the reasons that I love all those different works of art is that in a way is almost like the essence of the work that I do with women will be around here's you in your kind of your late 30s, 40s, and 50s, kind of making peace with that period of time in your life, in your 20s and 30s, where this big important life goal didn't happen. And it's almost like a homage for the women that I work with to that period of their lives, and how do we find a way to peace and connection and really embracing and kind of really loving her and making peace with her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there can be a
Yeah.
lot of regrets that women carry, a lot of
Mm.
self-criticism. I should have made this
Mm.
choice. Like there's a lot of complexity there. Um, so that's almost like the essence of the work.
Mm.
And then the other piece of the work is then going right back to the formative attachment, because that can impact as well, particularly around
Mm.
women's sense of worthiness and some of those
Yeah.
core beliefs about self. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because as soon as you get married, you're asked, when are you having children?
exactly right. Yeah,
What if I
yes,
don't want children or I can't have
exactly.
children?
Yeah, yeah,
So what I always question people with that is, why do you think that every woman wants children as well?
yeah, yeah,
Because, it's just,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
some women want a career and they're really condemned for having a career, but you're married.
yeah,
Why,
yeah,
like, why would you want a career? Because you're married, you need
yes,
them
yeah,
to feel
yeah,
fulfilled.
yes.
It's like,
And
no.
that legitimacy of choice and identity. And some people
Mm.
will say the most extraordinary things. So it'll be things like one of the things that really is quite triggering for women who are childless is um, when people preface a statement of empathy with "as a mother."
Yes.
And so, for
Oh.
example, it can really be quite painful for women to hear that, where it might be, a story of, for example, a child who's been treated really badly, or
Mm.
whether, there might have been something terrible has happened to a child.
Mm.
And when someone says "as a mother," and you're kind of left standing there going,
Mm.
as a childless woman, I think that's horrendous too. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's kind of like
Right.
there can be, so women kind of need to be a little bit mindful of that, I guess. And there can be other certain things that can be a little bit triggering as well.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and you're right, because that question of when are you going to have kids,
Mm.
there's a part of that which recognizes that children don't just, even though they're actually born and birthed through a woman and
Mm.
whatever her context is, those children themselves have this network of social relationships. And so it's not unusual for us to hear that when a woman has been unable to have children, there can be this sense of, oh, I didn't get to share being a parent with my partner, or I didn't
Mm.
get to make my partner a parent, or I didn't get to birth grandchildren for my parents, or
Mm.
my siblings. Like there might not be cousins for my siblings, or there might not be my my sister or brothers being able to be aunts or uncles, or so there
Mm.
actually can be, like, children exist within this fabric and network and relationships, and there can be griefs that are out, there can be the grief and the loss can touch on that broader family context as well.
Mm. Yeah.
So it's a really tricky thing, in that sometimes there might be some expectations around women having children in order to become a grandparent. And it's the difference between really respecting that person's choice, or
Mm.
understanding the agency that they have in being able to realize those choices. But then at the same time, there could be some genuine losses that that person's experiencing. So
Mm.
where's the place for them to have a voice and to process perhaps their losses? And it's not unusual for certain cultural contexts or certain social contexts, is that many of the women that I work with will be processing the grief in their 40s, and then perhaps by their 60s, peers are starting to have grandchildren, and then it's lots of conversations about grandchildren, and
Yeah.
there can be a loss when you're in that social context
Mm.
where
Mm.
you don't have children, so you're not going to have grandchildren. Or if you do have children and you don't have grandchildren, there can be
Mm.
this sense of missing out and potentially some loss there as well. So how do we work with just the complexity of those stories, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
hold space for people to process their feelings.
Mm. Mm. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh gosh, Sarah, I could go on forever with you. I really could.
It's the
This is
beginning.
amazing. Yeah.
It's
But
extraordinary.
yeah, so I think we'll probably need to wrap it up now. So how can people get in touch with you, and what services do you do and all that? So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So,
that'd be
Kate, thank you so much for holding this conversation. It's so rich and so courageous.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, being able to kind of open to the complexity of this.
Mm.
Yeah. So the best way to get in contact with me is through my website.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that then links into to to working with me. Um, I offer online counselling. So even though I'm based in Brisbane, I offer counselling across Australia and New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also work with another counsellor, and we offer groups for women. We actually offer in-person weekends.
Mm-hmm.
And also I offer kind of programs and courses and resources. So it might be, a webinar on childlessness and regret, or it might be unpacking grief, or
Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
yeah. So, and this last 12 months, along with two other counsellors in Australia, we were invited to be ambassadors for World Childless Week.
Oh wow.
So that's
That's
another part of
awesome.
our work as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Wow.
you. And so that's in
Mhm.
September, we have World Childless Week.
Right.
Um, and it's a wonderful website where women can go, or people can go, and there's lots of stories, lots of poetry, videos where women have really, not just women, but men as well,
Yeah.
um, have have talked about their experiences.
Mm.
And there's webinars each year, and there's a whole lot of webinars on that site as well. And yeah, it's a nice way to kind of keep in touch
Yeah.
with
I'll have to, yeah,
what's
I'll
happening.
link with that as well. That sounds
Yeah,
fabulous. Yeah.
you're really welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm sad to say goodbye, but thank you for your time. It's been wonderful and really rich, really, really rich. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate.